In a seemingly ordinary village, a deeply emotional story of love, betrayal, and resilience unfolds. Frank, torn between loyalty to his wife, Amanda, and the cold manipulation of his mother, faces a heartbreaking decision. Amanda, once a vibrant young woman with dreams of success, is left helpless after a stroke, trapped in her own body and abandoned by the very people she trusted the most. As her husband succumbs to his mother's heartless schemes, Amanda's journey from heartbreak to a remarkable transformation will take you through unexpected twists and turns. Watch how Amanda's silent suffering becomes her greatest strength, leading to a final confrontation that will leave you speechless. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. In a cramped, dimly lit room, two figures stood amidst the faded yellow wallpaper adorned with delicate floral designs. The first was Mrs. Flores, a petite woman whose silver hair framed her severe, unforgiving face. Her sharp features, a prominent aquiline nose and thin, tightly pressed lips, seemed to mirror the coldness of her heart. Around her neck, a weighty necklace clinked and swayed in rhythm with every biting, sarcastic word she spat out. "Frank, you understand we can't go on like this," she said, her voice dripping with irritation as she lifted her chin. "She's becoming a burden." Frank shifted uneasily, glancing at his mother with a mixture of defiance and deep-seated guilt. His once gentle expression was now overshadowed by a pitiful look, his hands fumbling in nervousness as he avoided her penetrating gaze. "But Mom, Amanda is still my wife," he mumbled, his voice tinged with desperation. Mrs. Flores waved her hand dismissively, a cruel snort escaping her lips. "Come on, Frank. If you truly cared, you wouldn't be considering another woman. And I'm not going to be stuck cleaning up after her every day. She's practically lifeless now, and you heard the doctor. She's got less than a year. What's the use in dragging this out? I think she'd be better off at her grandmother's house, surrounded by memories of her childhood. At least that way you'll get a decent inheritance once she's gone. That could finally help improve our situation." Frank stared at his mother, torn between his loyalty to his wife and the bitter reality she painted. The very next day, the hallway was cluttered with suitcases and bags containing Amanda's belongings. Mrs. Flores, her lips curling into a satisfied smile, watched as her bewildered daughter-in-law sat helplessly in her wheelchair. Amanda, once a vibrant young woman with golden hair, was now a shadow of her former self. At just 27, a sudden stroke had stolen away not only her mobility but also her voice. She was trapped in her own body, confined to a wheelchair, eternally silent. When Frank was at work, Mrs. Flores grudgingly took care of her, though Amanda often felt that her husband stayed late on purpose, dreading the sight of the wife who could no longer even manage basic tasks on her own. The truth was, Mrs. Flores had never liked Amanda. The young woman's ambitions and drive had always grated on her, and she resented Amanda's focus on her career instead of playing the role of a supportive wife. Amanda had worked tirelessly as an assistant director at a prominent company, dreaming of one day owning her own business, though she hadn't yet gathered the resources to make it happen. But after the stroke, whatever faint glimmer of sympathy Mrs. Flores had once held for Amanda vanished completely. If she had merely been a nag before, now she was a tyrant. The older woman's sharp tongue lashed out at Amanda with increasing frequency, and the fragile young woman was no longer able to defend herself. Mrs. Flores deliberately neglected her needs, often forgetting her medication or skipping her meals, relishing in the fact that Amanda could no longer protest. The only solace Mrs. Flores found in the entire situation was the blissful silence. Amanda's inability to speak meant she didn't interfere as Mrs. Flores immersed herself in rereading the old scripts from her acting days, a life she wished she could have had back. While Frank strained to drag the cumbersome suitcases down to the car, Amanda remained by the door, her heart pounding with helplessness. Her eyes, already swollen and red, brimmed with unshed tears as she watched the scene unfold in silent anguish. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, powerless to stop the nightmare from happening. Mrs. Flores, her smile cold and patronizing, turned to Amanda with false sweetness. "Don't worry, dear," she said, her voice laced with insincerity. "The doctor mentioned your heart isn't strong, and the fresh air in the village will do wonders for you. Who knows, you might even make it through the year. Besides, didn't you always want to return to your grandmother's home in the countryside?" Amanda's mind whirled with a storm of unspoken thoughts and emotions. If only she could voice the fury raging inside her, she would have unleashed a torrent of words on the old woman who was orchestrating her exile. But her voice had been stolen, leaving her trapped in a suffocating silence, unable to express the betrayal and despair that consumed her. "Frank, darling, what's taking you so long?" Mrs. Flores called out, her tone dripping with impatience as she watched her son struggle to catch his breath. His face was flushed with exertion as he hauled the weight of the bags, his every movement heavy with the burden of guilt. "The elevator's broken, Mom. I've had to carry everything down from the 20th floor," Frank replied, panting. Mrs. Flores clucked her tongue disapprovingly, casting a disdainful glance at Amanda. "I told you we should have hired a moving company," she chided, her voice sharp. "Mom, you know we can't afford that," Frank said wearily. Mrs. Flores sighed dramatically, her gaze drifting off into the distance. "Oh, there was a time when I was on stage every night, performing to packed theaters. Your father would rush over after his lectures just to watch me shine. Who would have thought that I'd end up here, changing diapers?" She shook her head in disbelief, her eyes narrowing in disdain as she looked at Amanda, who sat motionless, unable to defend herself against the cruel barbs. Just then, the neighbor from across the hall appeared, his curiosity piqued. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Flores. Are you all heading somewhere?" he asked, offering a polite smile. Mrs. Flores instantly transformed, her face lighting up with a warm, inviting grin. "Hello, we're taking Amanda to a rehabilitation center. The doctor believes it will be beneficial for her recovery," she said, her tone dripping with feigned concern. "That sounds expensive," the neighbor remarked, shaking his head sympathetically. Mrs. Flores nodded, her expression somber. "Oh yes, it is costly, but we can't possibly let Amanda go without the care she needs. She's done so much for us, after all." The neighbor nodded in understanding, offering a few more pleasantries before continuing on his way. As soon as he was out of earshot, the false smile vanished from Mrs. Flores's face, replaced by a deep scowl. She turned to Frank, her voice snapping with urgency. "Let's get a move on before the entire building finds out what we're doing. We should have handled this first thing in the morning before anyone was awake." Frank grabbed another suitcase, letting out a frustrated sigh. "It's cold in the morning, Mom. Do you want me to lose my fingers to frostbite?" Without waiting for a response, he marched toward the car, leaving his mother fuming in his wake. Frank, the fragile and overprotected only child of Mrs. Flores and her late husband Miguel, had been the center of their world from the moment he was born. The law professor and the theater star, who had welcomed him late in life, had sacrificed their careers and dreams to raise him, enveloping him in a cocoon of care. Yet, their devotion had left Frank ill-prepared for the harsh realities of life. Now, nearly 40, he remained tethered to his mother, working a dead-end job where he was ridiculed by his boss and avoided by his colleagues. As he loaded the last of Amanda's things into the car, he couldn't help but wonder how his life had become so painfully tangled in this web of duty, guilt, and resignation. 20 minutes later, Amanda, along with every trace of her presence, was packed into the car. Frank gently lifted her frail body, settling her into the back seat, carefully folding her wheelchair beside her. Tears streamed down Amanda's face, a silent cry for help that she couldn't voice. Frank, avoiding her gaze, whispered, "Amanda, please, calm down." His voice was a mixture of helplessness and fatigue as he buckled his seatbelt. "A neighbor will take care of you there. And of course, we'll be paying with your money," Mrs. Flores added with a casual air, as if discussing a simple transaction. Frank merely nodded, resigned to the reality they were imposing on her. "You know how bad things are for us right now," he mumbled. "It's for the best. For all of us." Amanda stared at her husband, her gaze unwavering, searching his face for any sign of compassion. any flicker of hesitation that might betray the man she once loved. But all she saw was a pale, detached expression, void of the empathy she so desperately needed. With a heavy sigh, Frank started the engine, and the car rolled away from the house they had shared, right as the clock struck noon. Mrs. Flores, feeling no remorse, waved them off, already thinking of the comfort of her armchair and the familiar lines of her beloved plays, where she imagined herself standing in the spotlight, adored by audiences. As the car sped down the road, Frank kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, refusing to glance at the rearview mirror where Amanda's tear-streaked face was reflected. "Amanda," he began, his voice shaky, "you have to understand, I don't have another option." For a brief moment, he thought he saw a mocking arch of her eyebrow, but when he rubbed his tired eyes and looked again, all he saw was her grief-stricken face, staring back at him in silent agony. "My mom is doing this for us. She's right, you know? I can't be there all the time, and she's getting older. You'll be better off with someone who can take care of you around the clock. You'll be back in the countryside, where you always wanted to be. Back to your grandmother's house," he explained, his voice faltering as he finished. But no matter how much he tried to justify his actions, the weight of Amanda's stare bore down on him, a silent accusation that made it harder for him to breathe. The journey to the remote village where Amanda was being sent seemed to stretch on endlessly. The village, barely more than a forgotten on the map, consisted of a few crumbling houses, empty streets, a solitary shop, and an abandoned medical office that had long since closed its doors. The dark blue car finally rolled past a small, weather-beaten house surrounded by an overgrown garden and a broken fence that looked as though it might collapse at any moment. Despite its neglect, the house had a certain charm, but Amanda's heart sank as they approached. This was her new reality. The garden, once lovingly tended by her grandmother, was now a jungle of tangled branches and tall, unruly grass that climbed higher than the fence in places. An old bench stood in front of the window, and on it lay a figure, a person, mumbling incoherently as they shifted and staggered to their feet. Amanda squinted, trying to make out who it was, but her vision blurred with tears. The woman who approached was a ghostly figure, her wrinkled face sagging with exhaustion, her hair a wild mess, and a dark bruise discoloring the skin beneath one eye. She wore mismatched clothes, a green jacket far too thin for the chilly air and worn pink shoes adorned with rhinestones, entirely out of place. You're early," the woman stuttered, her voice slurred. Frank frowned, glancing between the bedraggled woman and his wife. "Amanda, this is Rosa. She's going to be your nurse," he said, forcing a smile. Rosa, wobbling slightly on her feet, nodded in agreement as if to confirm her role. Amanda's heart sank further, the weight of despair crushing her. This was her new caretaker, the one who was supposed to nurse her back to health. And yet, standing there in that desolate garden, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she had been abandoned, not just by Frank, but by the entire world. Frank unloaded the suitcases one by one, each thud of the bags hitting the ground feeling heavier than the last. He even carried them inside the decrepit house, the creaking floorboards groaning under the weight of the luggage. Once everything was settled, he handed Rosa a thin envelope, its contents meager, but Rosa's satisfied expression revealed it was enough to keep her going. With a sigh, Frank stood before Amanda, who remained still in her wheelchair, her eyes full of anger and pain. "Amanda, come on, why are you so upset?" he asked, his voice lacking sincerity. "You should be grateful. This is your childhood home. Fresh air. Someone to care for you. What more could you want to be happy?" Amanda's thoughts raced, a flood of desires and needs that far surpassed the hollow words Frank had offered. But, as always, she remained mute, her eyes speaking volumes where her voice could not. Each glare cut deeper than any words could have, and for a fleeting moment, Frank felt a pang of guilt tugging at his heart. But then, as quickly as it had come, the feeling was swept away by thoughts of his mother's relentless advice and the tempting figures in Amanda's bank account. The promise of financial security drowned out any remnants of remorse, leaving only the anticipation of the wealth that awaited him. Frank climbed back into the car and waved half-heartedly at Amanda through the window. Rosa shuffled over to her new charge, offering a hollow greeting that only deepened Amanda's sense of abandonment. "Don't worry, Frank. She'll be fine here," Rosa said, though even she didn't seem convinced. Frank forced a strange, uneasy smile before driving off, leaving Amanda alone with nothing but a neglected house, an empty heart, and an alcoholic woman to watch over her. "Frank, are you telling me you never once checked on your wife in an entire year?" Mrs. Flores's voice was shrill as she stared at the calendar in disbelief. "A year, Frank? You're a fool. What if she died months ago? Or worse, what if she somehow got out of that wheelchair?" She shot her son a look of horror, the idea of Amanda recovering filling her with dread. Frank, who had just dragged himself through the door after a grueling day at work, looked at his mother with tired, half-lidded eyes. He hadn't even thought about Amanda in months, and now his mother's words hit him like a ton of bricks. He realized, with a mixture of guilt and indifference, that he hadn't visited his wife since the day he'd left her. Mrs. Flores, fuming, paced the room, her fury mounting. "Rosa calls me every week," Frank replied flatly. "Everything's fine. I send money every few months. It's all under control, Mom." But Mrs. Flores wasn't convinced. She marched over to where her son lay sprawled on the sofa, yanked the remote from his hand, and turned off the TV. "When I'm talking to you, look at me," she demanded, her voice dripping with theatrical outrage. "Rosa? That drunk? You left your wife in the hands of an alcoholic, and you think she's taking care of Amanda? For all you know, she's been drinking every penny you send and hasn't seen Amanda in months. Meanwhile, you're sitting here, glued to the TV, completely oblivious." Frank rolled his eyes, exhausted by his mother's incessant scolding. "Fine, fine," he muttered. "I'll go check on her tomorrow. I'll spend my one day off driving to that godforsaken village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mom, thank you for caring so much about me," he added with thick sarcasm. Mrs. Flores let out a dramatic huff, threw the remote back at her son, and stormed out of the room, muttering about his failures as a son and a husband. The next morning, Frank packed a small bag, grabbed an envelope stuffed with money, and reluctantly slid into his car. It was only 7 a.m., and he longed to be back in bed, still asleep, rather than embarking on this dreaded journey. He didn't believe his mother's fears. After all, Rosa had been diligent about picking up the money and keeping in touch. But since childhood, Frank had been conditioned to follow his mother's orders without question. So here he was, setting off for the village. The drive felt interminable. The radio was broken, leaving Frank to navigate the silent road with only his thoughts for company. He vaguely remembered the way to Amanda's childhood home, a place he had tried to forget. In recent months, he had avoided returning to that desolate village, choosing instead to meet Rosa in the city where she would collect the money. He had only been to the house 3 times. Once to leave his disabled wife behind, once to search for a caretaker, and once, many years ago, when he had proudly shown Amanda the place where he had spent his childhood. Now, the thought of returning filled him with dread. The silence of the car seemed to grow heavier, as if mocking him for his choices. Frank found himself stopping the car in front of a sight he hadn't anticipated. A nearly new fence surrounded a garden that, while overgrown, had been tended to not long ago. The neatly trimmed grass had since grown back, but its maintenance hinted at the care he hadn't expected. Confused, Frank got out of the car and cautiously approached the gate. He pushed it open and called out for Amanda or Rosa, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the wind. He walked up to the house and tried the door, but it was locked. Frustrated, he tugged at the handle, hoping to force it open, but the door refused to budge. Growing more agitated, he pulled out his phone and dialed Rosa's number, but the call went unanswered. Anxiety began to creep up his spine as he rubbed his forehead, scanning the property. For the first time, his mother's constant warnings didn't seem so far-fetched. Despite knowing Rosa's questionable reliability, Frank had always held onto a sliver of trust in her. But now, with no response from the house or Rosa, doubt gnawed at him. He knew where Rosa lived. Her home wasn't far from Amanda's, so he decided to head there. Leaving the car behind, Frank walked down the quiet, empty street, his unease growing with each step. Within minutes, he arrived at Rosa's dilapidated house, which looked even more run down than Amanda's. The sight of it made his heart sink further. As he pushed open the door, a pungent, foul odor assaulted his senses, causing him to gag and cover his nose in disgust. Inside, Rosa sat at a large round table, lazily sipping a yellowish liquid from a chipped glass. Her eyes were glazed over, lost in some foggy, drunken haze. Enraged, Frank stormed over to her, grabbing her roughly by the arm and dragging her outside. "Where is Amanda?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. Rosa blinked slowly as if trying to remember who Amanda was. "Who?" she slurred, her voice thick and unsteady. She stared ahead blankly, not seeming to register anything around her. Frank's patience snapped. "Where is my wife, you drunken fool?" he shouted, shaking her slightly. Finally, something seemed to click in Rosa's mind. "Ah, Amanda. She doesn't live far from here," she mumbled, her words almost incoherent. Frank gritted his teeth, his anger bubbling over. "Show me," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Rosa nodded sluggishly and began to shuffle down a narrow, empty path, leading Frank away from the familiar part of the village. They walked for what felt like an eternity, Frank growing more and more perplexed as they neared a grand house that stood out starkly against the humble surroundings. Unlike the other homes, this one was enormous, with 3 stories, a balcony, and a vast garden. Several cars and pieces of farming equipment were scattered around the backyard, giving the property a sense of wealth and activity. Rosa stopped a short distance from the wrought iron gates and pointed ahead. "She lives there now," she muttered before turning and walking away without another word. Frank was left standing in shock, staring at the impressive estate before him. Composing himself, he cautiously approached the gate and rang a small bell. Almost immediately, a cheerful voice answered from the other side. "Emiliano, why so early?" the voice called out, full of warmth and life. Frank froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice, it was unmistakable. Swallowing hard, he whispered, "Amanda." There was a long pause before the voice responded, softer now, almost hesitant. "Frank, come in." The gate swung open, and Frank found himself stepping into a breathtaking garden, with a stone path lined with vibrant flowers leading him toward the house. He walked slowly as if in a daze, his mind struggling to process what was happening. At the entrance to the house, a slender woman with blonde hair stood waiting for him. She was dressed elegantly in a beige suit and shawl, her posture graceful and confident. As Frank drew closer, he realized with a start that this was Amanda, his Amanda, but transformed. Her face, once pale and lifeless, now glowed with health. A soft blush colored her cheeks, her lips shimmered with a hint of gloss, and her eyes were subtly enhanced with eyeliner, making them sparkle with a brightness he hadn't seen in years. She smiled at him, a small, knowing smile. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said gently, stepping aside to let him in. "But now that you're here, come in." Frank was at a loss for words as he followed her into the house. The interior was just as stunning as the exterior, tastefully decorated in warm tones, with beautiful artwork adorning the walls and plush carpets underfoot. Every detail spoke of care and attention, a far cry from the neglected home he had left her in. He looked around in disbelief, struggling to reconcile this vision of elegance with the Amanda he had abandoned a year ago. As they walked through the house, Frank couldn't take his eyes off his wife. She moved with a confidence and grace he hadn't seen before, and despite the simplicity of her appearance, she radiated a beauty that left him speechless. How had this happened? How had she gone from the frail, broken woman he had left behind to this magnificent creature standing before him? Amanda led him into a cozy sitting room and gestured for him to take a seat. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice calm and serene, as if nothing had changed between them. Frank nodded numbly, unable to form a coherent response. His mind raced with questions, but none of them made it past his lips. All he could do was watch as Amanda gracefully prepared the tea, her movements precise and deliberate. When she finally sat down across from him, Frank found his voice, though it was shaky. "Amanda, how? I don't understand. What happened here?" Amanda met his gaze, her eyes calm but with a depth of emotion that Frank couldn't quite read. "A lot has changed, Frank. More than you can imagine," she said softly. "But let's just say, I found a way to heal, a way to move forward, even when everything seemed lost." Frank stared at her, his mind reeling. How had she done it? How had she gone from the broken, silent figure he had abandoned to this strong, confident woman sitting before him? He felt a pang of regret, deeper than anything he had ever known, as he realized that he had lost something precious, a chance to be part of her transformation. And now, standing in this beautiful home, surrounded by a life he had no part in, he wondered if it was too late to make things right. Amanda led Frank into a spacious, elegantly decorated room filled with plush sofas and armchairs that exuded warmth and sophistication. The soft glow of sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a serene ambience over the space. "I'll prepare some tea, and we can talk," she said calmly, before disappearing into the kitchen, leaving Frank alone to soak in the unexpected beauty of his surroundings. He sat in an armchair, his eyes darting around the room, unable to believe what he was seeing. The lavish furnishings, the tasteful decor, it all seemed surreal. He even pinched himself to ensure he wasn't dreaming. He had come expecting to find his sickly wife in a wheelchair, not the stunning, confident woman who had greeted him. Minutes later, Amanda returned, gracefully carrying a large tray adorned with several cups of tea. She handed one to Frank and took one for herself, settling into the chair across from him. "You didn't expect this, did you?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both sadness and strength. Frank, still reeling from the shock, shook his head in disbelief. Amanda's expression hardened, her voice taking on an edge. "I also didn't expect my beloved husband to send me off to die for the sake of money." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but Amanda cut him off with a raised hand. "Save your senseless excuses for yourself. I know everything, Frank. You're not exactly a master at hiding the truth. This was all about my inheritance, wasn't it?" Frank swallowed hard, his mind racing. How did she know? He thought he had been careful, but Amanda pressed on, her gaze unwavering. "When I received my grandmother's will from Germany, I was overjoyed, thinking about the life we could build together with the inheritance. But then, something happened that made me rethink everything. Do you remember my friend Christina from work?" Frank nodded, recalling Amanda's colleague. "She's the one who encouraged me to make some changes a year and a half ago." Amanda paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Christina asked me something that night, something I hadn't considered before. She asked if I'd be willing to sell my mother for money. She made me think about how much my grandmother left me, and whether the people around me, my own family, truly cared for me, or if they were just waiting for that money." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Amanda's words struck a chord. He remembered that conversation, the one Amanda had mentioned in passing about her inheritance from her grandmother. But he hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. Now, he was beginning to see just how much that conversation had changed everything. Amanda continued, her tone growing colder. "According to the letter attached to the will, I was my grandmother's last living relative. I was to receive a substantial sum of money, along with a share in a property in Germany. But Christina warned me. She warned me that sharing this news with you and your mother would only lead to one of two things. Either you would send me to an early grave for the money, or you'd suddenly start being the doting husband, hoping to get every cent of it." Frank clenched his fists, the truth of Christina's words stinging more than he wanted to admit. "Amanda, that's not fair," he stammered, trying to defend himself. "I never wanted to hurt you. Things just got out of hand." Amanda slammed her hand on the table, startling him. "Don't try to justify it, Frank. I've seen through everything now. I thought Christina was wrong, so wrong. That night, when I told you and your mother about the inheritance, everyone seemed so happy. Even your mother, who had never shown me an ounce of kindness, opened a bottle of her best wine. I convinced myself that Christina's suspicions were misplaced. Frank's heart sank as he remembered that night. He had been relieved when Amanda shared the news. It seemed like their troubles were finally over. But as time passed, his mother's insistent words had wormed their way into his mind. She had convinced him that Amanda's condition was a burden, that they could never live the life they wanted with her in that state, and the inheritance had become a tempting solution. Amanda's voice softened, though it remained laced with sorrow. For a while, things did get better. Mrs. Flores stopped scolding me, and you started spending more time with me. I thought we were finally turning a corner. She let out a bitter laugh. I was even naive enough to believe that we could make it work, that I could somehow still trust you. Frank's eyes dropped to the floor, shame washing over him. He remembered those weeks, how he had played the part of the loving husband, while his thoughts had been consumed by greed. He hadn't realized that Amanda had seen through it all. Amanda looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. I went out one day, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. I thought maybe Christina had been wrong after all. I was even planning to buy you a gift, a new tie to show you how much I still believed in us. But that day, something shifted in me. I realized that no matter how much I wanted to believe in you, deep down, I knew you didn't care about me. Not in the way that mattered. Frank's throat tightened, his mind scrambling for the right words. But there was nothing he could say to undo what had been done. Amanda had seen the truth in him, a truth he had been too cowardly to admit to himself. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. So I made a choice. I decided that if you weren't going to fight for me, I would fight for myself. And that's what I did, Frank. I found a way to heal, to rebuild my life, without you. She met his eyes, her expression resolute. And I'm not looking back. Amanda stood in front of the shop window, lost in thought, her mind miles away as she gazed absent-mindedly at the display. It wasn't until she turned her head slightly that she noticed Frank walking down the street. Relief washed over her at first. She had been meaning to talk to him about her plans for the future. But her breath caught in her throat when she saw a young woman approach him. Frank's arms wrapped around the woman, pulling her into a warm embrace. And then, before Amanda could fully process what was happening, he kissed her. Amanda's world crumbled in an instant. She took an instinctive step back, her legs trembling, and leaned against the shop window for support. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as she tried to make sense of the scene in front of her. It felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. How could this be happening? How could Frank betray her like this? But she didn't cause a scene. With the strength she didn't know she had, Amanda quietly turned and walked away. She went home and crawled into bed, her mind spinning with disbelief. The memory of Frank with that woman played over and over in her head, each time cutting deeper into her heart. She tossed and turned all night, trying to make sense of it, but no answers came. The next morning, Amanda couldn't bring herself to go to work. She needed answers. She needed to know the truth. Taking the day off, she found herself at a local detective agency. The office was small and unremarkable, with a musty smell lingering in the air. A slim, short man with glasses sat behind a cluttered desk, casually sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. Amanda sat down across from him, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside her. "How they met, where they go, what they do. I need to know it all." The detective nodded, taking notes as Amanda spoke. He assured her that he would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And so began a week of agonizing uncertainty for Amanda. She didn't dare tell Christina what had happened. She couldn't bear to hear the words, "I told you so," even though she knew Christina had been right all along. Her friend had seen through Frank from the beginning, refusing to be Amanda's maid of honor at their wedding. A decision that had left a deep wound in Amanda's heart. Though they had reconciled since then, Amanda had never fully let go of that pain. Only now did she begin to understand that Christina had always wanted the best for her, even if it hurt. A week later, Amanda's phone rang. The detective had finished his investigation, and she soon found herself back in his dimly lit office, her hands trembling as she prepared to hear the truth. "You know," the detective began with a small smile, "you're lucky your husband's mistress is quite talkative. It made my job a lot easier. I had to follow her for nearly a week, but I found out everything. Her name is Aisha Selik. She's 22, and she recently graduated from a teacher training college. She met your husband a few months ago, likely in a cafe." Amanda felt her stomach churn at the mention of the young woman. She clenched her fists, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Do you have any evidence?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like a video or something?" With a knowing grin, the detective reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old tape recorder. Amanda blinked in surprise, not having seen such a device since her childhood. It seemed like a relic from a bygone era. He pressed a knob and the recording began to play. "Frank!" A high-pitched voice squealed through the speaker. "Is this for me? Oh my God! It's beautiful. It must have cost a fortune. Don't worry about the money, sweetheart," Frank's voice responded, full of satisfaction. "Once I start my own business, I'll be able to spoil you with jewelry every day." Amanda's heart clenched painfully at the sound of his voice. It was unmistakable, her husband so casually discussing his plans with another woman. Then came the part that shattered the last remnants of hope she had clung to. "But when you talked to that girl," Aisha's voice continued, "you said you didn't have money yet for your business." There was a pause on the recording, and though Amanda couldn't see it, she knew Frank must have been smiling as he spoke his next words. "My wife," he said smugly, "recently inherited from her grandmother. I'll use her money to start the business and make a fortune." Amanda's hands shook as the recording ended. The betrayal was laid bare before her, undeniable and cruel. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had planned to use her for her inheritance all along. The detective's words barely registered as Amanda sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth crushing her. Everything Christina had warned her about had come true. Frank had never truly cared for her, only for what she could provide. As she left the detective's office, Amanda's mind raced with a million thoughts. But one thing was clear: she couldn't let Frank get away with this. She had fought to rebuild her life once before, and now she would do it again. Only this time, she wouldn't let anyone stand in her way. "You'll leave her, right?" Aisha's voice, sweet and angelic, drifted through the recording. "As soon as she's no longer necessary to me, yes," Frank responded confidently. His voice echoed in Amanda's mind, but the words began to blur as she became lost in her thoughts. She sat perfectly still, staring ahead as memories of their past flooded back. Amanda recalled how she had first met Frank, how enchanted she had been by his shy demeanor and quiet charm. She was 11 years younger, freshly graduated from the university with a degree in economics, when Frank swept her off her feet. He had taken her to a quaint cafe, walked with her beneath the stars in the park, and treated her to theater performances and concerts. She had been so captivated by him, by the life he had promised her. Mrs. Flores had seemed sweet and kind back then, too. Amanda, still grieving the recent loss of her mother, had been drawn to the Flores family. She thought she had found not only a husband in Frank, but a new family as well. Christina had tried to warn her, but Amanda had been too absorbed in her newfound feelings, too lost in the idea of building a life with Frank, to listen. The memories kept rushing back. Choosing Frank's wedding suit together, sorting through gifts after the ceremony, the moments when she had felt like the happiest woman alive. Even though Frank had never shared her dreams of building a business and a career, Amanda had convinced herself that their love would be enough to make up for their differences. Frank, so much like his mother, had always envisioned a more traditional life: family, children, and domestic stability. But Amanda had wanted more. She had longed for something beyond the confines of that narrow vision. And now all those dreams were shattered. The man who had never raised his voice at her was now planning to use her inheritance to build a future without her. The The betrayal was so profound, so surreal, that Amanda sat in stunned silence, staring at the wall, her mind racing to comprehend it all. The detective remained quiet, understanding that this was a moment of realization for her, a moment he had witnessed many times before in others. He had seen wives break down in tears, scream in fury, and even destroy property in their rage. Amanda, however, stood up calmly and walked to the water cooler. She poured herself a cup of water and downed it in one gulp, the cool liquid doing little to soothe the fire burning inside her. Christina's words echoed in her mind. Frank was capable of selling even his mother for money. She hadn't believed it then, but now it all made sense. Slowly, a plan began to form in Amanda's mind, and a cold, malicious smile crept across her face. The detective, noticing the change in her demeanor, instinctively took a step back. He had never seen such an expression on her before. A few months later, Frank's dark blue car pulled away from the crooked fence surrounding the dilapidated house where he had left Amanda, still believing her to be disabled. As soon as the car disappeared, Amanda stood up from her wheelchair with a deliberate slowness. Rosa, who had been watching from the doorway, gasped in disbelief as she witnessed Amanda rise to her feet. "Rosa," Amanda said calmly, her voice steady, "let's make a deal. I'll pay you the same amount my husband does, and in return, you won't tell him what you've seen here today." Rosa, still stunned, nodded wordlessly, unable to form any coherent response. Amanda smiled, satisfied. "Good, we'll get along just fine. Here's your first payment." She handed Rosa a small stack of bills. "Come back every month, and I'll give you more. Just keep telling Frank that nothing has changed with my condition. Make sure he believes he doesn't need to visit. Do we have an understanding?" Rosa nodded again, clutching the money as if it were a lifeline, and hurried away without another word. Amanda entered the old house and took in her surroundings. Everything was covered in dust, the furniture hidden under clothes, trash scattered across the floor, and a broken window that suggested someone had tried to break in at some point. She made her way to the old red sofa, pulled off the dusty cover, and sat down with a weary sigh, a cloud of dust swirling around her. From the pocket of her coat, she pulled out a phone that Mrs. Flores had miraculously failed to find during her many cleaning sprees. Amanda dialed the only number she could trust. "Come," she said into the phone. "Everything happened just as you predicted. I'm waiting for you." She set the phone aside and leaned back into the sofa, her mind buzzing with thoughts. Some clear, others just a jumble of emotions. Everything was different now, but in the quiet of that old house, Amanda felt a strange sense of clarity. An hour and a half later, the sound of the front door creaking open broke her reverie. She had managed to tidy up a bit, and now, as she looked up, she saw Christina standing in the doorway, holding a small shopping bag filled with wine and takeout. "To celebrate," Christina said with a mischievous grin, her eyes twinkling with a sense of triumph and camaraderie. Amanda couldn't help but return the smile, feeling a sense of warmth and hope that had been absent from her life for far too long. "Thank goodness you brought wine. I honestly wouldn't have made it through today without it," she admitted, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I still can't wrap my head around it. They left me here to die, believing those hastily written diagnoses as if they were some sort of prophecy. It's truly incomprehensible. They started celebrating, thinking I wouldn't have much time left, and no one even considered the possibility that things might not be as they seemed." Amanda and Christina settled down to eat, the atmosphere filled with a strange mix of relief and contemplation. The future felt uncertain, but Amanda knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Frank's betrayal define her life. "I'll stay here for a month or two, maybe longer, until I figure out what to do next," Amanda said after a few moments of quiet reflection. "For the first time in my life, I don't have any plans. It's unsettling, but maybe it's what I need." Christina looked around the dilapidated house and overgrown garden with a hint of skepticism. "What are you going to do here?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. "This place, it's so remote, so abandoned. You in this house, it just doesn't seem like a good fit. You're too strong to be hidden away like this." Amanda let out a soft sigh. I know it seems that way, but I need to slow down, Christina. If I throw myself headfirst into the chaos right now, I'll break. This place will give me time to calm down and to think. Besides, it's been years since I've had a real break. Maybe a little solitude is exactly what I need. Christina shrugged, unsure how to respond. She had always known something was off about Frank, even from the very beginning. Without fully understanding why, she had declined to be Amanda's maid of honor, a decision that had caused a rift between them at the time. But now, everything seemed to fall into place. She had always joked that Frank would sell his mother for money, and while it had been a flippant remark, it turned out to be eerily close to the truth. Frank, who had always seemed so spineless and unremarkable, had proven capable of abandoning his wife to die for the sake of an inheritance. It was wild, unthinkable. That night, Christina stayed over at Amanda's place, offering her support as they talked late into the night. But the next morning, she had to return to her own life. Amanda, on the other hand, had made a bold decision. She quit her job, something she had never imagined herself doing. Christina, of course, didn't have that luxury. Unlike Amanda, she didn't have an inheritance from a wealthy grandmother to fall back on. The new day began with a cold shower, the icy water shocking Amanda's senses awake. Her mind buzzed with thoughts, replaying the last 3 weeks, weeks that had felt like a descent into hell. She had given Frank a test, hoping against hope to see some glimmer of love or care from him, but all she had received in return was his indifference and an eager anticipation of her death. It was that realization, that her husband had expected her to die and was even looking forward to it, that hurt the most. Her old life was truly over. Now, she needed to find a way to pick up the pieces. Taking the money that Christina had brought with her, Amanda decided to venture out into the village. She vaguely remembered where the local store was but wasn't entirely sure. It had been years since she'd last been here, and the village had changed in subtle ways. The crisp morning air had a bite to it, signaling the arrival of fall. Amanda wrapped herself in an old coat she found in the closet, trying to keep warm as she made her way outside. The streets were quiet, with most of the villagers either at work or still at home. After a bit of wandering, Amanda managed to find the store without needing to ask for directions. It looked almost the same as it had 20 years ago. The familiar multicolored sign, the foggy windows displaying the counters inside, and the familiar smell of fresh bread drifting through the air. As she stepped into the store, Amanda was greeted by the scent of bread and a wave of nostalgia. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Hernandez, the same woman who had worked there when Amanda was just a little girl. The years had aged her, but there was still a warmth in her smile that Amanda recognized instantly. "Mrs. Hernandez, hello?" Amanda called out, a hopeful smile on her face. "Do you remember me?" The older woman hesitated for a moment, squinting at Amanda as if trying to place her. "You do look familiar, but I can't quite remember." Amanda's smile widened as she stepped closer. "I used to come here all the time when I was a child. My grandmother lived nearby." Recognition sparked in Mrs. Hernandez's eyes, and she let out a small gasp of realization. "Oh, Amanda! Of course, now I remember. It's been so long. How are you, dear?" Amanda nodded, feeling a sense of comfort wash over her. "It's been a long journey, Mrs. Hernandez, but I'm here, and I'm ready to start over." "Oh, Amanda! How could I not recognize you?" Mrs. Hernandez exclaimed warmly, stepping out from behind the counter. She pulled Amanda into a hug and kissed her on the cheek, her familiarity bringing a sense of comfort that Amanda hadn't felt in a long time. "I haven't been here in so many years, and yet nothing seems to have changed," Amanda said, glancing around at the familiar counters. "Could you sell me some groceries? I need bread, milk, butter, vegetable oil, pasta, rice, peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and honey." Mrs. Hernandez nodded thoughtfully and pointed toward the milk in the corner. "You'll want to get your milk from Mr. Leonardo. He's just down the road. This stuff here?" She wrinkled her nose in disdain. "Even a cat would be ashamed to drink it. Shelf life of 6 months. Can you imagine? Disgusting." And make sure you get some of those tomatoes over there. They're the tastiest I've had in years." Before Amanda could respond, the store door swung open with a loud bang, and a man stormed in. His clothes were dirty from what appeared to be a long day of hard work, and his expression was serious, bordering on harsh. He pushed past Amanda without a second thought and demanded in a loud voice, "Give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and the messenger should have left my order here. A box with medicine and pest repellent." Mrs. Hernandez looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "Emiliano, can't you see I have a visitor right now?" she said, her tone a mix of exasperation and amusement. Emiliano barely spared Amanda a glance, waving his hand dismissively. "She's just a city girl. If she needs something so badly, she can get it in the city. I need my things now." "Emiliano!" Mrs. Hernandez scolded him with a stern look. Amanda raised her hand, trying to diffuse the tension. "It's all right, Mrs. Hernandez. Let him go first. It seems like he's in more of a hurry than I am." Mrs. Hernandez shot Emiliano a disapproving look but went to retrieve the box. Amanda watched the exchange quietly, her curiosity piqued by the man's brusque manner. He was tall, with dark hair and hands that bore the marks of hard, manual labor. Despite his disheveled appearance, something was striking about him. His gaze was sharp, his expression serious, and although he seemed rough around the edges, there was an undeniable presence to him. He appeared to be in his 30s, maybe nearing 40, but still youthful in his way. Emiliano glanced at Amanda, his brown eyes narrowing slightly. "You're quite the principled person," he muttered gruffly. "I'm not in that much of a hurry, but even in the city, people respect the line. They're in more of a rush than you seem to be." Amanda couldn't help but smile, though she turned away to hide it, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. There was something oddly intriguing about this man, despite his rough demeanor. Moments later, Mrs. Hernandez returned with a heavy box and handed it to Emiliano. "Here you go. The mineral water is over in that corner." She pointed to a stack of bottles. "You can pay me later." Emiliano nodded, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water, and left the store without so much as a goodbye. "Who was that?" Amanda asked, still watching the door after he had gone. Mrs. Hernandez waved her hand dismissively as she returned to organizing the cereal shelf. "That's Emiliano, a local farmer. About 8 years ago, his father left him a small house and some livestock. Emiliano decided to take farming seriously and built up his business on his own. He's hired a few workers and is doing his best to make something of it. He's got big plans, but for now, he's mostly planting and selling food to this store and some of the neighboring villages. He's not a bad man, just a bit rough around the edges. No one knows why." Amanda nodded thoughtfully, intrigued by the brief encounter. "He seems intense." Mrs. Hernandez chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it. Emiliano's been through a lot, I think. He's not the kind to open up easily, but he's a good man at heart. He just keeps to himself most of the time." As Amanda gathered the rest of her groceries, she couldn't help but think about the mysterious farmer and the life he led in this quiet village. She had come here to find peace, to escape the chaos of her old life, and now she found herself wondering if this small, forgotten place might hold more for her than she had originally thought. Amanda gathered her grocery bags and trudged back home, the weight of them pulling on her arms with every step. She struggled under the load, but once she finally reached her small house, the sight of the stocked refrigerator filled her with a quiet satisfaction. The kitchen no longer felt barren, and the simple act of filling it up gave her a small sense of normalcy. After unloading the groceries, Amanda remembered Mrs. Hernandez's recommendation and set off to get fresh vegetables and dairy products from Mr. Leonardo. In the city, she had been accustomed to the convenience of supermarkets, where everything could be purchased in one place, but here in the village, buying from local people was the norm. She welcomed the change. Mr. Leonardo's house was indeed close to the store, just as Mrs. Hernandez had said. His yard was large, with a couple of goats lazily grazing nearby. Amanda found the old man working on a chair, his thick gray beard giving him a wise, weathered look. She introduced herself, explaining who she was. "Amanda," she said, extending her hand. Mr. Leonardo's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, Rita's granddaughter. I remember your mother well. It's good to see you here." Amanda smiled. "Yes, that's my mother. I was wondering if you sell vegetables and milk." About 20 minutes later, Amanda left Mr. Leonardo's place with 3 large bags that felt twice as heavy as her previous ones. The old man, with his generous heart, had sold her enough groceries to last a month, and though she had tried to refuse, she hadn't been able to turn him down. Now her back strained under the weight, and after only a few steps, she had to stop and put the bags down, catching her breath. Just as she was about to try lifting the bags again, a black car with a large body pulled up beside her. She heard a familiar voice and looked up to see Emiliano, the rugged farmer from the store. Amanda hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure she wanted to accept help from a man who didn't exactly exude politeness, but the prospect of carrying those heavy bags back was even less appealing. With a deep breath, she swallowed her pride. "Sure, I don't mind," she said, offering a small smile. Amanda chuckled, shaking her head. "No, I just needed to get settled in and make things a bit more comfortable. Maybe fry some potatoes over the fire and relax." As she reached for one of the smaller bags to help, Emiliano gently took it from her hands. The warmth of his touch lingered for a brief second, and Amanda froze, caught off guard by the unexpected connection. Emiliano quickly placed the bag in the car and closed the back of the truck. "Show me the way. Where do you live?" he asked. "Sure, I'll guide you," Amanda replied as she climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove, Emiliano glanced over at her. "So, you're from the city, right?" Amanda nodded. "Yes, I grew up here, though. Now, I've had some issues back home, and I needed a place to clear my head. I thought of my grandmother's house. It's always been a quiet, peaceful place, perfect for thinking." Emiliano drove fast, his hands steady on the wheel. Whether it was because he was in a hurry or simply his natural driving style, Amanda wasn't sure. But she noticed that his pace wasn't just limited to driving. Even in the store or when he had rushed past her earlier, he moved with a sense of urgency, as if he couldn't afford to slow down. "Yes, this village does have its quiet charm," Emiliano agreed, his tone softening as he spoke. He glanced over at her again, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What kind of problems made you come back here, if you don't mind me asking?" Amanda hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Just life, I guess," she said vaguely. "Things got complicated, and I needed some time to figure it all out." Emiliano nodded, his gaze returning to the road. "Well, you'll find plenty of time to think out here. This place has a way of stripping things down to the essentials." Amanda appreciated the way he didn't press for more details. She glanced out the window, taking in the familiar landscape of the village, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and uncertainty. Maybe, just maybe, this small, quiet town would give her the space she needed to rebuild her life. As Amanda carried her grocery bags inside, Emiliano walked across the drying grass, the crunching sound underfoot breaking the quiet. She watched him with curiosity, still trying to piece together the puzzle of this man who had suddenly appeared in her life. "There's no one to cut the grass?" Emiliano asked casually, glancing at the neglected garden. Amanda shrugged. "My grandmother used to do everything herself. Mowing, sewing, even repairing the roof. She was a tough woman right up until the day she died. But me? I'm just a city girl who barely knows how to keep up with any of it." Emiliano glanced at his watch, realizing the time. "I should be going. Sorry, I forgot to ask. What's your name?" "Amanda," she said, smiling slightly. "Amanda, that's a beautiful name. Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Amanda replied, mirroring his smile. With that, Emiliano nodded and walked back to his car. She watched as he drove away, the engine's rumble fading into the distance. As the quiet returned, Amanda stood alone, trying to decipher where this unexpected connection might lead. The next morning, Amanda was abruptly awoken by a strange sound, a mix of loud noises and whispers. She groaned, tossing and turning in bed, before finally giving up and stumbling to the window. Peeking outside, she saw Emiliano in the middle of her yard, swinging a scythe with precision. The once unruly grass was now arranged in neat, uniform rows as he worked tirelessly, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Amanda, still groggy and wearing a long linen dress she had found in her grandmother's closet, opened the window and called out to him. Emiliano stopped mowing, turned around, and looked up at her, his chest heaving with effort. "What are you doing?" Amanda asked, her voice tinged with surprise. Emiliano raised an eyebrow, his expression conveying what he thought of her question. "What does it look like I'm doing?" he asked, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "I'm mowing your lawn." Amanda rolled her eyes. "I can see that, but why are you doing it in my garden? Do you want me to stop?" Emiliano shot back, smirking slightly. Amanda shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation. She couldn't help but notice the way his gaze had lingered on her, and it left her feeling flustered. She quickly turned her attention to the small kitchen, deciding to make pancakes. Cooking was something she rarely did in the city. Her fast-paced life didn't allow for leisurely breakfasts. But here, in this quiet village, she had an unexpected guest who had taken it upon himself to help her. So the least she could do was feed him. By the time the sound of the scythe ceased and the morning quiet returned, Amanda had finished making the pancakes. She stepped out onto the porch and called to Emiliano, who was just putting the scythe away. "When you're done, come in for breakfast," she offered. Emiliano shrugged, set the scythe down, and walked into the house. He was still sweaty and looked tired, but there was an air of satisfaction about him. "You can use the shower if you want." Amanda nodded toward the bathroom before heading back to the kitchen. Emiliano washed up quickly and then joined her at the table, where a plate of pancakes and sour cream awaited him. Amanda stood with her arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Emiliano looked up at her, surprised. "Owe me? For what?" "For the work you did," Amanda replied, her tone practical. "You didn't do it for free, did you? I assume you're expecting something in return. Maybe for the food." Emiliano smiled, leaning back in his chair as he bit into a pancake. He held her gaze, his eyes twinkling with something she couldn't quite place. "You city folk, always thinking there's a price for everything. Haven't you heard of help without strings attached?" Amanda let out a snort of laughter. "You said you're from the city. Mrs. Hernandez told me you've only been living here for 8 years, so don't act like you don't get it." Emiliano chuckled and nodded. "You're right. I was like that once too, surprised whenever someone offered help without expecting anything in return. But I've learned that life here is different. People help each other because it's just what you do." Amanda shrugged, not quite convinced. "Maybe, but I'm used to paying for any work that's done for me. It's how things work in the city." Emiliano looked at her thoughtfully, then asked, "So, what did you do in the city? What was your job?" Amanda hesitated, then answered, "I was an assistant to the director of a company. I wasn't exactly making a fortune, but I enjoyed the work. I was learning how to run a business. I had big dreams, until I had a stroke." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head at the memory. "But that's a story for another time. Today I have to clean the house and the attic, and I have a friend coming tonight, so it's a busy day." Emiliano smiled, understanding that she wasn't ready to delve into the details just yet. "Well, I should get going too," he said, finishing his breakfast and standing up. Amanda watched him leave once again, her eyes following him as he disappeared down the road. There was something about Emiliano that intrigued her, a mystery she couldn't quite unravel. But for now, she had other things to focus on. Later that afternoon, Christina arrived with the things Amanda had requested. When she stepped into the yard, she let out a low whistle, impressed by the clean, neatly trimmed lawn. Dropping the bags, she called out to her friend, who was busy scrubbing the dirty windows. "You cleaned up this place. Who helped you?" Christina asked, her tone playful. Amanda wiped her hands on a rag and looked up, smiling. "I need to replace some of the glass. Do you know where I can find a handyman?" she asked, skipping the greeting entirely. Christina grinned. Looks like you've got things under control here. But if you need a handyman, I think I might know just the guy. Christina chuckled as she began peeling potatoes. So, tell me more about this farmer, she prompted with a teasing smile. Amanda sighed, leaning back in her chair. Him? I didn't know him before he showed up here 8 years ago. That was around the time my grandmother passed away. He runs a farm, has animals, orchards. Nothing too extraordinary. Christina raised an eyebrow. Is he rich? Amanda frowned, puzzled by the question. Why does that matter? Because, Christina replied matter-of-factly, it's important nowadays, but more importantly, how is he as a person? To you? Amanda hesitated, thinking about her interactions with Emiliano. I don't know. He's a bit of a contradiction. 1 minute he's being rude to me in the store, and the next he's giving me a ride home and mowing my lawn without asking. He even refused to take money for it. Christina grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Maybe he likes you. Amanda waved her off. Don't be ridiculous. He probably just thinks I'm some helpless city girl who can't do anything on her own. Or, Christina said with a smirk, maybe you've finally got a normal man in your life. Just something to consider. Amanda rolled her eyes but didn't respond. The idea of Emiliano liking her seemed far-fetched, though she couldn't deny he had been showing up more and more often. Christina changed the subject. So, how's work going without you? Amanda sighed. From what I hear, our boss has completely lost it. He's already gone through 3 assistants since I left. Turns out, I was doing a lot more than he realized. For the past month, Amanda had been adjusting to life in the village. The small house had become a refuge of sorts, and she had settled into a quiet routine that alternated between rest and reflection. But the sudden lull in her once busy life irritated her. She had always been someone who thrived on work. Growing up in a modest family, Amanda had started working right after school and had never taken time off without a solid reason. Now, she found herself with endless days stretching before her, filled with little more than reading, visiting neighbors, and waiting for Emiliano's inevitable appearances. It was strange how often she crossed paths with him. After hearing about the broken glass, he had shown up the next morning to fix it without her asking. Amanda had made him a meat pie in gratitude, and then he fixed the garden gate as well. In return, she cooked him breakfast again. This happened several more times until she no longer found it surprising to hear the sound of his work outside or see him sitting at her table. Their conversations were never long or deep. Emiliano didn't bring her flowers or shower her with compliments. He simply showed up, quietly helping with repairs or chores, and then shared a meal with her. It was an unspoken arrangement that left Amanda feeling both perplexed and comforted. She longed to understand his motives, but every time she tried to broach the subject, he brushed it off with a joke or a smile. Confess, Emiliano? Amanda teased one morning, watching him tinker with the faucet. You just come here for the food, don't you? Emiliano glanced up at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I wouldn't say that, he replied, his tone light but his eyes thoughtful. That was how most of their interactions went. Short, discreet, and peppered with humor. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on. And apparently, she wasn't the only one noticing Emiliano's visits. One afternoon, as Amanda stood on her porch, a curvy brunette stormed up to her, fury written all over her face. Without warning, the woman tore a leaf from a nearby tree and threw it at Amanda, her eyes blazing with jealousy. Emiliano is mine, you hear me? The brunette snapped. You think you can just waltz in from the city and steal our men? How stupid are you? Amanda stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. The stranger glared at her for another moment before turning on her heel and marching away, leaving Amanda bewildered on the porch. She hadn't realized just how much attention Emiliano's visits were drawing, or how much trouble it could cause. When Emiliano visited her again, Amanda mentioned the admirer who had caught her attention. Were you afraid? He asked with a slight grin, though his words carried a trace of seriousness. Amanda shook her head, her voice firm. I'm not scared of some village girl. I faced down men twice my size when I worked for a big corporation. There was a time when I refused to sign a contract for my boss, and 5 suited men nearly pinned me against the wall. That was real fear. A little note from a crazed admirer. Just someone who sees you fixing everything in my house. Doesn't compare. Emiliano simply smiled, quietly returning to his meal, leaving Amanda to her thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and Amanda found herself walking through town, her mind clouded with uncertainty. Emiliano hadn't visited in some time, and she feared he had grown weary of her company. As she wandered the streets, she couldn't help but hope that fate might guide her steps to Emiliano once more. The silence he brought into her life had become something she strangely missed. It was during this aimless stroll that she encountered Mrs. Hernandez, who was emerging from the store with a troubled expression. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hernandez?" Amanda inquired, sensing the older woman's unease. "No, dear." Mrs. Hernandez sighed heavily, her voice tinged with worry. "Emiliano's farm is in trouble. There's a serious problem, and everyone is on edge. Our men and women depend on that farm for their livelihoods, and if it fails, well, there's no other work for them in this town. Emiliano's always managed to keep things running, just barely, but now it seems like everything's falling apart." Amanda's brow furrowed in concern. Without a second thought, she decided to visit Emiliano. His farm was 2 kilometers from town, a sprawling estate with a large, weathered building where the lowing of cows echoed through the air. The backyard was busy with workers, though the fields beyond, once lush with crops, now lay barren in the cool autumn air. Amanda spotted a woman passing by and asked for directions to Emiliano's office. The office was small, almost cramped, with a simple table and chair at its center, a dusty cabinet in the corner, and a single window that barely let in any light. Emiliano stood hunched over a pile of papers, muttering to himself as he punched numbers into a calculator, his frustration palpable. Amanda quietly approached him. "Hi," she greeted softly. Emiliano turned abruptly, his face tight with stress. "Did something break again?" he asked, his voice strained. "Now's not a good time." "No," Amanda replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I heard you were in trouble, so I came to help." Emiliano's response was curt. "It's just some paperwork. I can handle it." But Amanda was undeterred. She stepped closer, nearly pushing him aside to get a better look at the documents. Annoyed, Emiliano raised his voice. "Leave or I'll have to make you." Ignoring his outburst, Amanda's eyes scanned the papers. It only took a moment for her to grasp the situation. The farm's finances were a mess, burdened by unnecessary expenses far too extravagant for a small operation like his. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial advisor?" she asked, incredulous. "I've been managing just fine on my own," Emiliano insisted, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed his words. Amanda's gaze softened with understanding. "I can see how well you've been handling it. A wild spree of spending that's driving you straight into the ground. You need a specialist, Emiliano. And where exactly am I supposed to find one?" Emiliano's voice faltered, tinged with despair. A confident smile spread across Amanda's face as she pointed to herself. "I have a degree in economics, and I spent years working in a company where the budgets and financial complexities dwarfed yours. Let me help." Emiliano, weary and overwhelmed, sank into a chair and waved his hand, conceding defeat. He let Amanda take over the mountain of paperwork. They spent the rest of the day, well into the evening, untangling the financial mess. By the time they emerged from the office, darkness had fallen, and the farm was eerily quiet. The workers had long since gone home, leaving the place eerily still. "Why do you have both refrigerators and milk deliveries 3 times a day?" Amanda asked as they walked. "One delivery is enough and the rest can be stored. There's no point in wasting money on extra trips. A lot of your expenses are like that, poorly thought out and draining your resources." Emiliano scratched his neck, clearly out of his depth. "I was in the military, not the business world. My father always dreamed of having his farm, something big, with fields that stretched on forever. I guess I'm just trying to make his dream come true, even if it's a bit late. Amanda's heart ached as she looked at him, understanding the weight of his burdens. The wind was cool, the night peaceful, and yet there was an undercurrent of tension between them, unspoken but felt. Suddenly, Emiliano broke the silence. "So, what's the story about the stroke?" he asked, his voice cutting through the night. Amanda froze, caught off guard. She had meant to keep the mood light, but Emiliano's question reminded her of a promise she had made. Taking a deep breath, she began to share her painful truth. "It all started when I devised a plan," Amanda began, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled the conversation with the detective. "Christina helped me set it in motion. She found a doctor who, for a price, agreed to tell my husband that I was in intensive care after a stroke and that I couldn't be visited. 2 weeks later, the doctors told my husband that there was no hope and that I would die soon. They sent me home to spend my last days with my family. During all that time, my husband only called twice, and when I came back in a wheelchair, he treated me as though I didn't exist. That's when he got the idea to bring me here, so I could just die quietly and not be a bother." Emiliano's grip tightened on Amanda's hand as she spoke, offering silent comfort. She looked down at their intertwined hands and felt a deep sense of gratitude for his quiet support. "Why don't you go back to the city?" he asked gently. "I thought about it," Amanda admitted, her voice softening, "but I realized I don't want to. The city is so hectic, always rushing forward. And it's a constant reminder of Frank and everything I lost." Emiliano released her hand and picked up his pace, turning to her with renewed energy. "Come on. I have something to show you." They walked for what felt like an eternity, the night growing colder as they moved farther from the farm. Amanda had no idea where they were headed, but when they finally arrived, she couldn't help but gasp in surprise. Emiliano had led her to a massive, elegant house surrounded by a tall fence, a sight that left her speechless. The room fell silent after Amanda's last words, the weight of the truth hanging heavily in the air. Frank's face turned pale, his eyes darting between Amanda and Christina, searching for some sign that this was all a cruel joke. But the stern expressions on their faces told him everything he needed to know. This was no game. "You both plotted this entire thing? To test me?" Frank's voice trembled, a mix of disbelief and anger. Amanda nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I had to know the truth, Frank. I needed to see if there was anything left between us and if you still had any decency in you. But all you cared about was yourself and your new life with Aisha. You were willing to let me die, thinking you'd inherit everything and live happily ever after." Frank's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white. "I can't believe you'd go this far," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Christina stepped forward, her tone icy. "You deserved to know how it feels to be discarded, to be treated like a nuisance. Amanda spent years giving everything to you, and you threw it all away the moment something shiny and new came along." Frank looked down, his anger beginning to fade, replaced by a deep sense of regret and shame. He knew he had made mistakes, but he never imagined it would lead to this. His wife, the woman he once loved, standing before him as a stranger, someone he had hurt beyond repair. Amanda took a deep breath, her voice softening slightly. "I never wanted things to end this way, Frank. I wanted to believe that the man I married was still in there somewhere. But now I see that he's long gone. This is goodbye, Frank." As Amanda turned to leave, Frank reached out, his voice pleading. "Wait, Amanda, please." But Amanda didn't stop. She walked out of the room, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. Christina lingered for a moment, looking at Frank with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "You had everything, Frank, and you let it slip through your fingers. I hope you can live with that." With that, Christina followed Amanda out, leaving Frank to face the emptiness that now surrounded him. He sat there in silence, the realization of his actions crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The life he had taken for granted was gone, and he was left with nothing but the memories of what once was, and the bitter taste of regret. The courtroom was tense, with every eye on Mrs. Flores as she finished her tearful testimony. Her performance, filled with dramatics, painted Amanda as a manipulative woman who had faked illness to deceive her husband and his mother. The murmurs among the spectators reflected a mix of sympathy and skepticism. Amanda sat calmly beside Christina, her lawyer and closest ally. Emiliano, sitting a few rows behind, watched Amanda with a steady gaze, his presence a constant source of strength for her. He knew this trial was not just about property. It was a battle for dignity, justice, and the future they were building together. As Mrs. Flores finished, the judge turned to Christina, signaling that it was her turn to cross-examine the witness. Christina stood up gracefully, her demeanor professional and unyielding. She approached the stand with a calm authority, her voice firm but respectful. "Mrs. Flores," Christina began, "you testified that you took care of Amanda during her illness. Could you clarify for the court what specific medical training you have that qualifies you to determine whether someone is truly ill?" Mrs. Flores hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I'm not a doctor, but I know when someone is faking." Christina nodded as if considering the answer. "So, you have no medical expertise, correct? And yet, you're accusing my client of faking a serious condition without any professional evidence to support your claim." Mrs. Flores shifted uncomfortably. "I know what I saw. She wasn't as sick as she claimed." Christina's eyes narrowed slightly. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Flores, that your son, Frank, left Amanda when she was most vulnerable, seeking out another woman while she was still recovering? And that you supported his decision, encouraging him to pursue a divorce so that he could gain financial advantage?" The older woman bristled. "My son deserves better than a wife who deceives him." Christina took a step closer, her voice lowering as she delivered the next question. "Did it ever occur to you, Mrs. Flores, that Amanda's supposed deception was the strength she showed in moving forward after being abandoned by your son? That she chose to rebuild her life rather than dwell in the misery he left her in?" Mrs. Flores didn't respond, her face turning pale. The judge watched the exchange intently, noting the shift in the witness's demeanor. Christina turned to the judge. "Your Honor, it's clear that this case is not about deception, but about greed. Frank abandoned his wife, took up with another woman, and now seeks to claim half of what Amanda has worked so hard to build, after leaving her to die alone. This case should not be about dividing assets, but about protecting what is rightfully Amanda's." As Christina sat down, Frank's lawyer stood up, clearly rattled by Christina's questioning. He attempted to redirect the narrative, but the damage had been done. The judge was no longer interested in Mrs. Flores' melodramatic account. The focus was now on Frank's abandonment and Amanda's strength. The trial proceeded with further testimonies, each one reinforcing Amanda's integrity and Frank's betrayal. Emiliano testified with quiet confidence, speaking of Amanda's resilience and their shared dream of rebuilding the farm. His words painted a picture of a woman who, despite her suffering, chose to rise above and create a new life. Finally, it was time for the judge to deliver the verdict. The courtroom was silent, tension hanging in the air. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the judge began. "It is clear that the plaintiff, Mr. Frank Flores, has acted with disregard for his marital responsibilities and has sought to gain financially from his wife's hardship. The court finds that Mrs. Amanda Flores is entitled to retain full ownership of the properties in question, as they were acquired through her efforts and are not subject to division. Furthermore, Mr. Flores' claim is denied, and he is ordered to pay all court costs." The courtroom erupted in whispers as the judge's gavel came down. Amanda's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. She turned to Emiliano, who smiled warmly at her, his eyes filled with pride. Christina hugged Amanda, whispering, "We did it. It's over." As they left the courtroom, Frank watched them go, his face a mask of bitterness and regret. He had lost not only the case but also the woman he had taken for granted, and now he was left with nothing. Amanda walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining down on her face. She looked at Emiliano, who took her hand and smiled. "Ready to start our new life?" he asked. Amanda nodded, her heart filled with hope. "Yes," she replied. "I'm ready." The courtroom was a mix of relief and tension as the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of a tumultuous case. The verdict was clear. Amanda had successfully defended her rights and reclaimed what was rightfully hers, despite Frank's attempts to claim a share. As the judge rendered the decision, Frank and Mrs. Flores' faces were etched with frustration and anger. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of approval from those who had witnessed the proceedings. Amanda, with Emiliano by her side and Christina smiling triumphantly, felt a wave of relief wash over her. Christina, always the astute lawyer, had meticulously dismantled Frank's claims, exposing the truth behind his accusations and the deceitful tactics he used. The recordings and testimonies she presented painted a stark picture of Frank's character, while the evidence regarding the apartment renovations highlighted the substantial contributions Amanda had made. Emiliano, standing tall beside Amanda, was a pillar of support. His calm demeanor and reassuring presence had been a constant source of strength throughout the trial. As he embraced Amanda, his joy was palpable. "Now that the court has decided, we can finally put all of this behind us," Emiliano said, his voice filled with hope. "We've fought hard for this, and it's time to look forward." Christina, still glowing from the victory, joined them, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "I told you we'd take everything from him," she said, her voice brimming with a mix of triumph and relief. "It's all rightfully yours, Amanda." Amanda, her heart full, hugged her lawyer and Emiliano tightly. The sense of justice served and the support of her loved ones created a moment of profound contentment. "Thank you, both of you," she said softly, "for everything." Amanda glanced down at her belly with a thoughtful smile. "Yes, focusing on the future sounds perfect. And if it includes a little one, then it will be even better." Emiliano, a playful grin on his face, turned to Christina. "You certainly have a knack for timing. Are you ready to take on the role of godmother?" Christina's eyes lit up. "Absolutely. I wouldn't miss it for the world." As they left the courthouse together, Amanda felt a renewed sense of optimism. The trials of the past were behind her, and ahead lay a future filled with promise. With Emiliano by her side and the support of her loyal friend Christina, she knew that they would build a life filled with love, joy, and new beginnings. In the coming days, Amanda and Emiliano looked forward to starting their new chapter, free from the shadows of the past. With the legal battles behind them, they could now embrace their future with hope and excitement. As Amanda rested her hand on her belly, she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her journey was only just beginning. As we wrap up this incredible journey, it's clear that resilience, integrity, and support can truly transform our lives. From overcoming betrayal to reclaiming what's rightfully ours, Amanda's story is a testament to the power of standing firm and moving forward with hope. So, what have you learned from Amanda's journey? How can you apply these lessons to your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share one thing you've learned and how you plan to put it into practice in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.